What we'll cover tonight covers the topics of what are the kind of demographics of scoliosis, what types of spine curvatures we can find with scoliosis, and what are the things that define when someone is positive for having scoliosis in their spine. Let's first talk about how many people have scoliosis. In the United States alone, there are 6 to 9 million people diagnosed with scoliosis. And there's an estimated 3 million new cases in the US every year. And that's mostly adolescents. However, that doesn't mean that adults aren't diagnosed. The demographic for scoliosis is 5 to 1 girls to boys, with that ratio increasing 3 to 1 as the age groups age into puberty and beyond. To each a curve of their own, meaning that scoliosis is categorized differently for each person. Yes, we can put them into categorizations, and I'll go over those, but everyone has a particular curve that is individual to them because of the different parts of genetics and the life that they lead. So here we are with different types of scoliosis. We can find that there are several curve patterns. There is the C shape where you're bending to one side. And this one's in the thoracolumbar area. And this is the lumbar area, and this is a sacral area. When we look at the spine, we can see that there are two shapes that can occur. We have the S-shaped curve, where it bends a little bit to the side in the lumbar, and then the opposite direction in the thoracic, or the vice versa, where it can bend in the thoracic and cause an opposite bend in the lumbar curve. This doesn't mean that there aren't more than two curves. You can actually have more than two curves. You can have a third and a fourth curve that occurs at the neck, or it is a compensatory curve because it's making up for the curve that happens in thoracic, or we can have another curve that happens in the lumbar sacral area, that is the lumbar pelvis area, because of the amount of deviation from this lumbar curve. Other things to talk about are kyphosis. Now, kyphosis is the forward motion of the thoracic spine, and lordosis is the backward arching of the spine. When we have too much of these curvatures, it is called a hypercurvature, a hyperlordosis, or a hyperkyphosis in the thoracic area. The opposite is also true. We can have a lack of curvature in these two zones, and that is called a hypokyphosis or hypolordosis. That usually results in something that looks more like this picture here. We call a flat back, a flat spine, and that means a very narrow spine that is lacking the within norms of the curvatures of kyphosis and lordosis. Scoliosis itself is what we call a 3D spine. It is not a two-dimensional diagnosis. We understand this to be 3D because it is not just a side bend. When the back side bends, when the spine side bends, it both side bends and rotates to the opposite direction. So therefore, if we are bending the spine to the left, there is a right rotation of the spine. And this begins to affect the internal organs and the rib cage and the bony anatomy. This means that on the left side, the ribs are more compressed, and so is the organs within the rib cage, as well as the organs underneath the gut in that area. And the rib cage is pushed more forward on the left side. And on the right side, for a left side bending curvature, on the right side, the ribs are more spread out and pushed backwards. This is what creates the raising of the shoulder blade on the outside of the curvature. If we think about the muscles lining parallel on the lines of the spine, on the left and right of the spine, that help support and keep our spine nice and elongated, the left side in a left side bending scoliosis is shortened and weakened in a shortened position. The muscles on the right side of the spine are lengthened. They're actually being stretched out along the spine because they're reaching over from the right side, reaching over, and they are stretched out and they are lengthened but weakened because they can't keep holding on to bring the back into this midline. So they're overworking and weakened into a fatigue state. And when they're overworked, they tend to thicken. And that's what leads to this feeling of the right side in a left side bending spine to seem thicker and give this impression that we need to stretch that side when we don't need to stretch the already lengthened right side of the muscles of the spine. Structural scoliosis is something you're born with. It's in your genetic code. And it's actually within the spine itself, and you can see these in x-rays when we look at a scoliosis spine, that the spine actually has developed with grooves that kind of like the lines of a tree when you see a tree growing, that actually turn and rotate the spine, the vertebrae. A functional scoliosis is something that happens after sustained or repeated motion pattern. So this can happen from an occupation or an actual anatomy thing or trait that's off in another part of the body. For example, if you have a leg length discrepancy where one leg is longer than the other, it can cause a side bending of the spine, as you can see in this picture here. And it can cause the curvature to occur where there's left side shortening and again right side lengthening, but it's not at the spinal level. It is a compensatory reaction of the spine after the effects of the lengthened leg. We can also see this when we have weaknesses in the legs, and this happens when we have like a weakened foot or hip, and this causes that hip to fall inward. In this picture, we see that this is happening on the right side, and this can also cause a leaning of the hip and then a compensatory bending of the spine. So how do we test for scoliosis? Scoliosis testing externally without x-rays happens with this test. It's called an Adams forward bend test. And this is simply someone standing with their feet together and putting their hands together and then leaning toward their feet. And when a person does not have scoliosis in the spine, you will not see a bending or rotating of the spine when they lean over. However, when they do have scoliosis, you'll see the structural change and you'll see a rotation and side bending of the spine. And we use this rotation as, again, we talked about the anatomy. Scoliosis is a side bending and rotating of the spine. We can see that rotation and we can measure that rotation. We can also look at x-rays, and we want to look at x-rays in the long format, from head all the way down to pelvis. You can get it down to the toes, but really head to pelvis is the primary things that we are looking at to test positive for scoliosis. An x-ray is the definitive way to diagnose if someone has scoliosis. We can see the rotations in the spine. We can see compensatory things that are happening. We can see if the hip is causing the actual curvature or if it's happening at the spinal level. This is an absolute must. So you must get an x-ray if you haven't already had one, if you want to figure out if someone is positive for scoliosis. You get these two types of visualizations, or two types of images. This one here on the left side is an AP view, an anterior posterior view, and the one on the right is a sagittal view, a side profile view. Both are very important to look at the curvatures and the kyphosis or lordosis of the spine. From the external point of view, as a physical therapist, if we don't have x-rays, we use the Adams forward bend test. Now, with this Adams forward bend test, we use what's called a scoliometer, and we put that on top of the spine to see the trunk rotation, and we can measure the trunk rotation. Now, I must stress this, that the rotation of the spine does not mean that the number of rotation is the curvature number of the angle of the scoliosis curve. The side bending does not correlate one-to-one for the rotation of the spine. So that's important to know, because you can have a fairly narrow, small scoliosis curve, but you can actually have a moderate amount of trunk, or rather spine rotation there. Here's another thing that's important with x-rays, is particularly for the adolescent's diagnosis, because we want to look at the age of the spine. The age of the spine tells us how much maturity is left to happen. If someone has a large scoliosis, a significant and moderate to severe level of scoliosis, we want to know how much time is left in their growing. If they have a moderate scoliosis and they're on this kind of cusp of, do we need surgery, do we not need surgery, how much bracing should we do, does it matter at this point? We want to know if they've stopped their growth period and they're going through puberty essentially. And we can look at this via x-rays at the pelvis and at the hands. So the pelvis x-ray and the um, testing and numbering of this or evaluating this is called a riser score, and they look at the growth plates along the top of the iliac crest, the pelvic crest, and it depends how much that it has fused, this growth plate has fused with that pelvic crest. If it hasn't fused at all, that is called a 0. If it has fused completely, it goes up to a 4 on, a 5 on the riser scale. The Tanner scale is the hand x-ray, and this is becoming more and more relevant for us to figure out the end stages of puberty and growth, because what we're finding is that this pelvic x-ray can be finished, but we can still find growth plates unformed or not fully formed in the hand x-ray. So it is important to get the hand x-ray. Scoliosis is treated with bracing, and bracing is done throughout the day, or you wear a night brace only. And this is really dependent on the discretion of the doctor and depending on how the doctor believes how moderate or severe or at risk the adolescent really is. And we also use bracing in combination with physiotherapy scoliosis specific exercises or physical therapy scoliosis specific exercises. And then the other hopefully last option here is surgery, when these other things just can't be enough because of the either rapid progression of growth that we see over time with the scoliosis, and that's different per person. Let's look at the different brace types. This is called the Milwaukee brace, which we really don't see too much anymore, at least I haven't in New York. And this is the Boston brace in the middle here, and this is the Rigaud-Chenot brace on the right. I tend to have my clients go for the Rigaud-Chenot brace, and then most of the doctors in New York are going toward the Rigaud-Chenot brace. We can see the Boston brace is very similar, and that's a whole nother discussion. We could talk about the pros and cons of the two. I am noticing, however, that the Boston brace does have cutouts similar to the Rigaud-Chenot brace now. So we are starting to see these hard braces more travel toward the Rigaud-Chenot brace, just as an FYI. So I'm keeping this here just so that you are aware of the different variety of braces out there, and so that you can ask questions for your child. This is the Providence brace. The Providence brace is a night brace, and that's literally it. It doesn't worn during the day. It's just for them to wear during nighttime when they're sleeping. And that, again, is really up to the discretion of the doctor. There is another brace that is called the Scoli brace, and that it is a brace that was developed by a chiropractor. And this brace, I find, is the other option when we find that if kids are just not compliant with these hard braces and they just can't, whether it's psychologically or physically can't deal with that brace, the Scoli brace does give you that other option. However, I must say that there isn't a lot of research out there showing the congruence of the Scoli brace and Schroth PT, or scoliosis specific exercise, of the 7 schools we're going to talk about next. But I don't want to outright say that it's wrong for you. It is still a brace that gives you some support, and it is something to remind you of your curvature. And working with exercises, I believe that there is the possibility that that can be beneficial. But again, the Rigaud-Chenot brace is something that I would more advocate for, just from my experience.